In the harshest places on Earth, where survival itself seems impossible, some souls refuse to surrender, and sometimes a stranger becomes their only hope. Marcus Webb had crossed deserts before, but never one quite like this. The Sahara stretched endlessly in every direction, an ocean of sand and stone beneath a merciless sun that turned the air itself into waves of shimmering heat. As a wildlife documentary photographer, Marcus had traveled to some of the most remote corners of the planet. But this assignment, documenting the impact of climate change on desert ecosystems in southern Morocco, was testing every limit he thought he had. The sandstorm had appeared on the horizon with almost no warning, a wall of churning brown that seemed to devour the landscape as it approached. Marcus's guide, Hassan, had immediately turned their Land Rover toward the nearest settlement. But they both knew it would be close. Desert storms could be deadly, reducing visibility to zero, stripping paint from vehicles, and disorienting even the most experienced travelers until they wandered in circles until their supplies ran out. "We need to find shelter," Hassan shouted over the rising wind, his words nearly lost in the growing roar of the approaching storm. "There's an abandoned research station about 2 kilometers ahead. If we can reach it." The storm hit before he could finish the sentence. One moment, Marcus could see the desert stretching before them. The next, the world disappeared into a brown chaos of sand and wind. The particles pelted the windshield like hail, and even with the wipers on maximum speed, Hassan could barely see more than a few feet ahead. The vehicle rocked with each gust of wind, and Marcus gripped the door handle, his heart pounding as he realized just how vulnerable they were out here. "There," Hassan pointed to a dark shape emerging from the sand-filled air, the outline of a building, low and weathered, but solid. The research station. They made it inside just as the storm reached its full fury, the wind howling like a living thing around the concrete walls. The station had been abandoned for years, left behind when funding for the climate research project had dried up, but it still offered protection from the worst of the storm. Hassan immediately began checking their supplies, assessing how long they could wait out the weather. Marcus moved to one of the windows, watching the apocalyptic scene outside. Sand filled the air so completely that the world had turned monochrome brown, and visibility was reduced to perhaps 10 or 15 feet at most. This wasn't just a storm. It was the desert asserting its dominance, reminding any humans foolish enough to venture into its domain that they were here only by its permission. And then, through the chaos, Marcus saw something that made his blood run cold. Movement. Not the random swirling of sand, but purposeful movement. Something struggling, something alive, about 30 feet from the station's door. "Hassan," Marcus called, not taking his eyes off the spot where he'd seen the movement. "There's something out there." Hassan joined him at the window, squinting into the storm. "I don't see anything." "Marcus, it's probably just debris, or maybe—" "There," Marcus pointed. "Look, something's moving, something's struggling." For a moment, they both stood silent, and then Hassan saw it too. A shape half buried in the accumulating sand, trying desperately to move, but clearly weakening with each passing second. Is that a dog?" Hassan's voice was filled with disbelief. It was. Through the swirling sand and limited visibility, Marcus could now make out the unmistakable form of a dog. A large one, perhaps a shepherd mix or something similar, partially buried in sand that the storm was piling around it with every passing minute. The animal was collapsed on its side, its movements growing weaker, and Marcus realized with horror that if they didn't act immediately, the dog would be completely buried alive. "I'm going out there," Marcus said, already moving toward his gear. "Marcus, no, it's too dangerous. The storm. We'll bury that dog in the next 10 minutes if we don't do something." Marcus pulled on his protective goggles and wrapped a scarf around his face, preparing for the brutal conditions outside. I can't just watch it die, Hassan. I can't. Hassan studied Marcus's face for a long moment, then sighed and began pulling on his own protective gear. Then we go together. You dig, I'll anchor you so you don't get lost in the storm. But we have to be fast. This weather is only getting worse. They tied a rope between them, a lifeline in the chaos, and pushed open the door. The wind immediately tried to rip it from their hands, and sand pelted them like thousands of tiny needles. Marcus's breathing became labored almost immediately, the scarf over his face helping, but not eliminating the sand that seemed to find every gap, every opening. The 30 feet to the dog felt like 30 miles. Marcus had to lean into the wind at a 45-degree angle just to make forward progress, and several times he stumbled over hidden rocks or dips in the sand. His eyes stung despite the goggles, and his heavy breathing was the only sound he could hear over the roar of the storm. But finally, he reached the dog. The sight nearly broke his heart. The animal was a large mixed breed, probably weighing 70 or 80 pounds when healthy, but now so emaciated that every rib was visible beneath skin that was stretched tight over bone. His coat was matted and filthy, covered in sand and debris, and in several places, Marcus could see injuries, cuts and scrapes that had become infected, raw patches where the skin looked damaged from sun exposure and dehydration. The dog's eyes were barely open, just thin slits showing a hint of brown iris. Sand had already accumulated around and on top of him, creating a burial mound that would have been complete in another few minutes. The dog's front paws made weak scratching motions, an instinctive attempt to escape the sand that was slowly consuming him, but he clearly had almost no strength left. "I've got you," Marcus said, though he knew the dog probably couldn't hear him over the storm. "Hold on, buddy. Just hold on." Marcus began digging frantically with his hands, scooping away the sand that had piled around the dog's body. It was like trying to bail out a sinking boat. As fast as he cleared sand away, more blew in to replace it. But gradually, working with desperate speed, Marcus exposed more of the dog's body, freeing his legs and torso from the weight of the sand. The hardest part was lifting him. Even severely underweight, the dog was still a significant burden, and Marcus's boots kept slipping in the shifting sand. But with Hassan moving closer to help, they managed to get the dog into Marcus's arms. The animal made a weak sound, not quite a whimper, more like a sigh of resignation, but didn't struggle. He was far too weak for that. The journey back to the research station was even more difficult than the journey out. Marcus staggered under the dog's weight, fighting the wind with every step, sand pelting his exposed skin, his breathing coming in gasps that left his throat raw and burning. Hassan stayed close, one hand on Marcus's shoulder, guiding him, keeping him oriented toward the station's door. When they finally stumbled back inside, and Hassan slammed the door against the wind, Marcus carefully laid the dog on the concrete floor and collapsed beside him, his entire body shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. "Water," he gasped. "We need to get water into him, slowly. Too much too fast and he'll get sick." Hassan was already moving, grabbing their supply of bottled water and their emergency medical kit. Together, they worked on the dog with the practiced efficiency of people who understood that minutes mattered. The dog was in catastrophic condition. Beyond the obvious dehydration and starvation, his body temperature was dangerously high, hyperthermia from exposure to the desert heat. His gums were pale and tacky when Marcus checked them. His pulse was rapid and thready, and when Marcus gently pinched the skin on the back of his neck, it stayed tented instead of snapping back. A clear sign of severe dehydration. "How long do you think he's been out here?" Hassan asked quietly, carefully dribbling water into the side of the dog's mouth. "Days, maybe longer," Marcus replied, examining the infected wounds on the dog's legs and sides. "These injuries aren't fresh. They've had time to get infected. And the level of dehydration and starvation, this didn't happen overnight. But how did he get here? We're 50 kilometers from the nearest village. Did someone abandon him? Marcus felt anger rising in his chest at the thought, but he pushed it down. Right now, the why didn't matter. Only the what they needed to do to keep this dog alive. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening as the storm raged outside. They cooled the dog's body temperature gradually with wet cloths, careful not to cool him too quickly, which could send him into shock. They gave him water in small amounts, frequently, watching carefully for any signs of vomiting or distress. They cleaned his wounds as best they could with the limited supplies they had, applying antibiotic ointment and covering the worst ones with gauze. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the dog began to respond. His breathing became less labored. His eyes, which had been mere slits, opened more fully, revealing beautiful dark brown irises that tracked Marcus's movements. When Marcus offered water again, the dog actually lifted his head slightly to drink, rather than just accepting the water passively. "That's it, boy," Marcus encouraged, stroking the dog's head gently. "You're a fighter. Keep fighting." The storm continued through the night, but by morning it had begun to weaken. Hassan made contact via satellite phone with their support team in Marrakesh, explaining the situation and arranging for a veterinary team to meet them when they could safely travel. "They want to know if you're sure about this," Hassan said, relaying the message. "Taking responsibility for the dog, I mean. He'll need extensive veterinary care, probably thousands of dollars worth, and getting him back to the States, if that's what you're planning, will be complicated and expensive." Marcus looked down at the dog, who was now resting more comfortably, his head on Marcus's thigh. Despite everything he'd been through, when Marcus petted him, the dog's tail made a weak thumping sound against the floor, a gesture of trust and gratitude that made Marcus's throat tight with emotion. "Tell them I'm sure," Marcus said. "I didn't dig him out of that sandstorm just to abandon him now." 3 days later, when the storm had fully passed and the roads were clear, they made the long drive back to Marrakesh. The dog, Marcus had started calling him Sahara after the desert that had tried to claim him, rode in the back of the Land Rover on a makeshift bed of blankets, growing slightly stronger with each passing hour as he received regular water and small amounts of food. At the veterinary clinic in Marrakesh, Dr. Amina Khalil gave Sahara a thorough examination and delivered her assessment with a mixture of amazement and concern. "He should be dead," she said bluntly, reviewing the x-rays and blood work. The level of dehydration, the malnutrition, the infections, the heat exposure, any one of these things could have killed him. All of them together should have been fatal. But somehow, he held on. Dr. Khalil looked at Sahara, who was resting on the examination table, his eyes following the conversation, even though he couldn't understand the words. "With intensive treatment, yes, I believe so. He'll need IV fluids for several days to fully rehydrate. The infections will require strong antibiotics. The malnutrition will take weeks to correct. We'll have to reintroduce food very slowly to avoid refeeding syndrome. And there's damage to his paw pads from walking on hot sand, which will need time and treatment to heal." "Whatever he needs," Marcus said. "Money isn't an issue. Just save him." The treatment took 2 weeks. Marcus stayed in Marrakesh, visiting Sahara every day at the clinic, watching as the dog slowly transformed from a barely alive creature into something that resembled a normal dog again. The change was remarkable. With hydration, Sahara's eyes became brighter, more alert. With nutrition, his body began to fill out, ribs becoming less prominent, muscles developing where before there had been only skin and bone. With treatment for his infections and wounds, his obvious pain decreased, and his movement became easier, more natural. But the most dramatic change was in his spirit. The defeated, Resigned dog Marcus had pulled from the sand, became increasingly engaged with the world around him. He greeted Marcus with tail wags and happy whines. He played gently with toys the clinic staff brought him. He showed affection to everyone who helped care for him, as if understanding that all these people were working to save his life. "He's remarkable," Dr. Khalil told Marcus during one visit. "Most dogs who have been through this level of trauma develop fear or aggression. But Sahara, it's like he knows he was saved, and he's grateful for every moment of his second chance." Getting Sahara from Morocco to the United States was a complex process involving health certificates, import permits, rabies titers, and specific airline requirements. But Marcus navigated all of it with the same determination he'd shown when digging Sahara out of the sandstorm. Nothing was going to stop him from bringing this dog home. The flight from Marrakesh to New York, with a connection in Paris, took over 20 hours. Sahara traveled in a special travel crate in the climate-controlled cargo hold, and Marcus worried the entire journey, counting down the minutes until he could see his dog again and confirm he was okay. When they were finally reunited at JFK Airport, Sahara's reaction made every hour of worry worth it. The moment Marcus opened the crate, Sahara leaped out, his strength fully returned now, and practically knocked Marcus over with the enthusiasm of his greeting. Tail wagging so hard, his entire back end was moving, whining and licking Marcus's face as if they'd been separated for years instead of hours. "I missed you too, buddy," Marcus laughed, hugging the dog tightly. "Welcome to America. Welcome home." Marcus lived in a small house in Vermont, surrounded by forests and mountains, about as far from a desert as one could get. When Sahara first stepped out of Marcus's truck and looked around at the green landscape, the trees, the grass, the small stream running through the property, his reaction was almost comical. He stood perfectly still for a long moment, as if his brain couldn't quite process this much green after so long in the monochrome browns of the desert. Then he took off running, racing through the grass with pure joy, rolling in it, drinking from the stream, exploring every corner of his new home with the enthusiasm of someone who had been given a gift beyond price. "He's never seen anything like this, has he?" Marcus's neighbor Ellen asked, watching Sahara's antics from over the fence. She was a retired veterinarian who had agreed to help Marcus with Sahara's ongoing care. "Probably not," Marcus agreed. "Based on the scarring and his condition when I found him, he'd been living as a stray in the desert for months, maybe longer. This," he gestured at the lush Vermont landscape, "this is paradise to him." Over the following months, Marcus watched Sahara continue to transform. The dog who had been on the edge of death became vibrant and healthy, his coat growing thick and glossy, his body reaching a perfect weight, his energy seemingly boundless. But Sahara wasn't just physically healing. He was emotionally thriving too. He became Marcus's constant companion, following him from room to room, lying at his feet while Marcus edited photos, sleeping at the foot of his bed every night. When Marcus went on hikes through the Vermont mountains, Sahara trotted alongside him, no longer struggling with the heat or terrain, his tongue lolling in a happy grin. Marcus began sharing Sahara's story on social media, posting before and after photos that showed the dramatic transformation from the nearly dead dog half buried in desert sand to the healthy, happy animal playing in Vermont's snow. The response was overwhelming. The posts went viral, shared hundreds of thousands of times. News outlets picked up the story. Photographer rescues dog from Sahara Sandstorm. And suddenly Marcus was doing interviews, appearing on morning shows, sharing the dramatic photos and video footage from the rescue. But more importantly, Sahara's story inspired action. Donations poured in for animal rescue organizations working in North Africa and the Middle East. Volunteers came forward to help with rescue efforts in harsh climates. People shared stories of their own rescued animals and the joy those pets had brought into their lives. A year after the rescue, Marcus was invited to give a presentation at a wildlife photography conference. Standing before an audience of his peers, with Sahara sitting calmly beside him on stage, the dog had become remarkably well-behaved and loved being around people. Marcus shared not just the dramatic rescue photos, but also the deeper story of what the experience had taught him. "I went to the Sahara to document how climate change is affecting desert ecosystems," Marcus said, his hand resting on Sahara's head. "I wanted to capture the harshness, the challenges, the way the desert is changing, and I did get those shots. But I also found something I wasn't looking for, a reminder that even in the harshest environments, life fights to survive. And sometimes, if we're paying attention, if we're willing to act, we can help that life win its fight." He showed the audience the photo sequence. Sahara half buried in sand during the storm, barely visible in the apocalyptic chaos. Sahara in the research station, his eyes half closed, clearly on the edge of death. Sahara at the Marrakesh clinic, beginning to recover. And finally, Sahara in Vermont, healthy and vibrant, running through snow with pure joy on his face. "This is the same dog," Marcus said quietly, "from one extreme environment to another, from dying alone in a sandstorm to thriving in a Vermont winter. The transformation isn't just physical, it's spiritual. Sahara has taught me that resilience isn't just about surviving. It's about how we respond to second chances when they're offered to us." The audience erupted in applause, but Marcus wasn't finished. "A lot of people have asked me why I risked going out into that storm. They've said I was crazy, reckless, that I could have died trying to save a dog. And they're right, it was dangerous. But here's what I know. In that moment, when I saw Sahara struggling, half buried and giving up, I had a choice. I could stay safe inside the research station and watch him die, or I could do something about it. And I realized that some choices define who we are, not what we think we are or what we tell ourselves we are, but who we actually are when it matters." Sahara, as if understanding the importance of the moment, stood and leaned against Marcus's leg, looking out at the audience with calm dignity. "Sahara was abandoned in one of the harshest places on earth," Marcus continued, "but he didn't give up. He kept fighting, kept trying to survive, even when the desert was literally burying him alive. And when help finally came in the form of a stranger stupid enough to run out into a sandstorm, he trusted. He let himself be saved. That takes courage too. The courage to accept help, to believe in second chances." A year later, Sahara isn't just surviving, he's thriving. He has a home, a family, a life full of love and adventure. He goes on photography assignments with me. He's become quite the Instagram star, and he's living proof that the worst circumstances don't have to define our future. That rescue, true rescue, isn't just about the moment of saving someone. It's about everything that comes after. The commitment to see it through, to provide not just survival, but a life worth living. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes. When Marcus finally left the stage, his phone was already flooded with messages from people sharing how Sahara's story had inspired them to adopt rescue dogs, to volunteer at shelters, to make donations to animal rescue organizations working in difficult areas. But the message that meant the most came from Dr. Khalil in Marrakesh. "I just watched your presentation. Sahara looks magnificent, happy and loved, and everything a dog should be. You didn't just save his life that day in the storm, Marcus. You gave him a reason to want to live. That's the greatest gift any of us can give. Thank you for showing the world what compassion looks like in action." That evening, back in his Vermont home, Marcus sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, colors that once would have reminded him only of the desert heat, but now also represented warmth, safety, and the beauty of second chances. Sahara lay beside him, his head resting on Marcus's foot, his breathing deep and even, completely at peace. Occasionally, his paws would twitch in his sleep, and Marcus wondered if he was dreaming of running through Vermont forests, or perhaps replaying memories of the desert that had almost claimed him. "You know what's amazing?" Marcus said softly, knowing Sahara was asleep, but needing to say it anyway. "A year ago, you were dying alone in a sandstorm, and I was just a photographer trying to do my job. Neither of us knew that our paths would cross, that a storm would bring us together, that we'd end up here." He stroked Sahara's thick fur, so different from the matted, sand-filled coat he'd first touched in that research station. "You've changed my life as much as I changed yours. Before you, I was always moving, always chasing the next assignment, never staying in one place long enough to really connect with anyone or anything. But you taught me about commitment, about the value of being there for someone who depends on you. You taught me that the best stories aren't always the ones I plan to tell. Sometimes they're the ones that find me when I'm not looking." Sahara stirred at the sound of Marcus's voice, lifting his head and looking up at him with those warm brown eyes that had once been dull with approaching death. "I love you, buddy," Marcus said, scratching behind Sahara's ears in the spot that always made the dog's leg kick involuntarily. "And I'm so grateful that storm happened when it did, where it did, and that I was stubborn enough to go out into it. Because if any of those variables had been different, I wouldn't have you, and that would have been a tragedy for both of us." Sahara's tail thumped against the porch, and he licked Marcus's hand with gentle affection before settling back down with a contented sigh. Sahara's story became a book, which became a documentary, which became an educational program about animal rescue in extreme environments. But more than any of that, it became a beacon of hope, shared and reshared millions of times across the world, that reminded people that ordinary individuals are capable of extraordinary acts of courage when they choose compassion over safety. And every year on the anniversary of the rescue, Marcus donated to organizations working to rescue and rehabilitate animals in North Africa and the Middle East. He funded mobile veterinary clinics that could reach remote desert communities, supported spay and neuter programs to reduce the number of strays, and helped train local rescue workers in emergency animal care. "He's become quite the philanthropist," Ellen joked one afternoon, watching Sahara supervise Marcus as he packed camera equipment for their next assignment, this time to document successful animal rescue programs in Morocco. From rescue case to rescue ambassador. "He earned it," Marcus replied, pausing to ruffle Sahara's ears. "Every animal in a harsh environment, every stray struggling to survive, they all have Sahara's same potential for transformation. They're all worth saving." Sahara proved that. Because that's exactly what Sahara was. Proof that the harshest circumstances don't have to be fatal sentences. That second chances can transform lives completely. That the courage to act in critical moments can create ripples of hope that spread far beyond the original deed. And so Sahara lived, and thrived, and bounded through his Vermont paradise, a desert survivor, a rescued soul, a beloved companion, and an eternal symbol that even when the world is trying to bury you alive, hope can dig you out and carry you home. Years later, when people asked Marcus about his most memorable photograph, he wouldn't show them images of exotic wildlife or dramatic landscapes. Instead, he'd pull out a photo taken on his phone, a simple image of Sahara sleeping peacefully on a Vermont porch, backlit by golden afternoon sun, looking utterly content and safe. "This," Marcus would say, "is my masterpiece, because it represents something more valuable than any award-winning shot I've ever taken. It represents the moment when I stopped just documenting life and started actively saving it. It represents the choice I made in a sandstorm to dig instead of walk away. And it represents every day since then that Sahara has been alive and loved, days that wouldn't have existed if I hadn't acted. Photography taught me to see, he would conclude, what Sahara taught me to do, and that's made all the difference. The desert had tried to take Sahara's life, had almost succeeded in burying him beneath its endless sand. But instead, through intervention born of compassion and sustained by commitment, that same desert became the place where two souls found each other, where a dying dog found his savior, and where a wandering photographer found his home in the form of a loyal companion who would never let him forget the power of choosing courage when it matters most. And that is the miracle of rescue, not just the dramatic moment of saving a life, but the quiet, ongoing choice to make that saved life worth living, day after day, year after year, until the memory of near death transforms into the reality of abundant life.